more. I see there are more people joining us. Welcome to everyone. We're just waiting for the warm-up band to get here. And do they still do that? You can see how long it's been. I don't think I've been to a concert like that in 50 years. So, but we're waiting for a few more and we'll get started then. Welcome to everyone. Well, if anyone else joins us, we will welcome them. Why don't we begin those? Does this sound good? Oh, there's some nods out there. I'll take that for a yes. Well, welcome to this faculty panel as part of this week of events. I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Michael Birkel, and I teach courses largely in spirituality here. Why don't we begin by letting the faculty members who are joining us here say a word or two about themselves before the larger conversation begins. Jim.
Thank you. My name is Jim Higginbotham. I teach pastoral care at ESR, and currently I'm serving as Associate Dean with responsibilities for the academic stuff while we search for a full-time dean. To let you know about who I am, my spirituality is based largely in Christianity and the church. I'm a person who grew up in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. I'm ordained in that tradition. It's a mainline American denomination, and it has a certain sense of openness to many ideas because there are no creeds like Quakers. And so my sense of spirituality has developed and broadened from that, and I think I've been heavily formed by my life here in the last 15 years, teaching a spiritual formation class and being forced to examine myself through many classics of Christian spirituality, including Quaker classics like John Woolman and Howard Thurman. My sense of activism has evolved from, I would say, from college and taking an ethics class where we really learned about where I first had my eyes open to systemic issues. And since then, my own sense of understanding of the world has evolved more and more towards recognizing that we live in an unfair world, that winners and losers are almost predetermined by various kinds of identities, and that is not the world that was envisioned by my spiritual and religious tradition. And so the two themes of our conference have informed each other and shaped me in ways such that I think, more and more contemplative and more active, and find that those two go hand in hand. I commend to you many of the other workshops that have already occurred this week. I was able to attend a few of them that offer some really valuable ideas for growing ourselves, that I resonate with, and engaging the world. And I'm hoping that our conversation today will help each of us get a clearer sense of why we want to be engaged in the world, what it is about us that motivates that. Because for me, it's not simply the injustice, but even as I go deeper into myself, I find myself more connected to people. As I go deeper into the mystery of what I call God, the Holy Spirit, I find more beauty and goodness in the world that I want to preserve and expand and magnify. And so this opportunity for conversation is one that I hope will open my eyes to other lenses of that goodness and beauty. I think that's enough for an opening.
Thank you, Jim. Grateful for your words. Grateful to be your colleague. I'm going to proceed by just by whose face is next on my screen, and I know our screens are different, but it's about the same orderliness as arranging yourselves chronologically by height. So, Steve, you're next. Are you willing to say a few words?
Sure. So I'm Steve Angell. I teach Quaker Studies at ESR and have done so for, I think this is my 20th year now. I also teach the American Religious History class, and some others. My particular background, as you might suspect from my discipline, is that I am a Quaker. I grew up in a Quaker meeting in, well, actually several in Pennsylvania and New York. You may know that there are varieties of Quakers, including programmed and unprogrammed. The meetings that I grew up in were unprogrammed, which meant that we gathered in silence and waited for God to speak to us. Or maybe a better way to put that is that there was a voice within, but sometimes we borrow the language of Elijah in First Kings, a still small voice that he heard, or the light or inner light are other terms. There are various synonyms. It was often a very quiet service with adults and children sitting around in a circle in silence, and usually somebody would speak, and often more than one person would speak, and the messages often seemed to fit in well with each other. That God or the Holy Spirit was leading people in a similar direction. I went to a Quaker boarding school for high school, West Town, and although I did not go to Quaker college, I kept up with the Quaker meetings in Boston where I was going to school, and became very involved in social justice movements of various varieties. This was during the Vietnam War, so I was active in anti-war movements and in support of the labor unions, and eventually became an activist in a movement, one of the early movements to reduce what we call these days mass incarceration. And I worked in Washington, D.C. for the Unitarian Service Committee and the American Friends Service Committee on projects to increase alternatives to prison, and I also at the same time became involved in a program that now Miriam Bunner is more connected to, the Alternatives to Violence project, which teaches nonviolence training skills to prisoners. With the I would say that it would be an understatement to say that we were not making much progress in the struggle against mass incarceration in the 1970s, when I was most intensely involved in that. And after a few years of that, I decided to come out to ESR, which turned out to be a perfect place to come and to explore the ethical and spiritual dimensions of that, and then also that's where I picked up my enthusiasm about Quaker studies, and went on for doctoral work at Vanderbilt University, where in addition to studying Quakers, I also studied African American churches, and wrote about 19th century African Methodist Episcopal ministers and their work. So since then, I remain very much involved with my Quaker meeting. I belong to a small Quaker meeting in Oxford, Ohio, still unprogrammed. Some of my activism now is through that meeting, opposition to the death penalty, or last summer, the whole meeting decided, to go together to the Black Lives Matter protest in Oxford, and we all stood socially distanced in a very diverse crowd to express our solidarity with our brothers and sisters of color, the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many, many others in downtown Oxford. So maybe that's enough for me for now. I'll pass it back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Steve. I think I'm beginning to get the sense there's a quite a range of experiences represented in this Zoom room, and I look forward to hearing more. Lonnie, I know you've got a long personal history, both as a contemplative and as an activist. Would you be willing to share a few words with us?
You're wrong, Michael. I wanted to go back a ways in my life because until recently, I probably would not have drawn any sort of connection between what I might call spirituality and activism in that way. And I'm the Peace and Justice Studies person here at the School of Religion. I'm supposed to also do a course in the spirituality of peacemaking. But to give you a sense of my inadequacy in that realm, Michael's predecessor some years ago gave me what was called the Idiot's Guide to Spirituality. You know, those idiot guides to various things, you know, because she was aware that, no, I really wasn't getting it. So anyway, but there was something very important in my education in college that helped set the groundwork for it. Sure, Ben, I'll loan it to you. And that seems to be really important. And I think of something of what we're trying to do here, rather than saying, as it's implied in this discussion, that there's one form of spirituality and one form of activism, and we're trying to teach you that. It's what's going to give you the undergirding to sort of figure out how you're going to connect those two, if you do. In the sample class this weekend, I asked people to get a piece of paper and draw 2 circles. They could be different sizes. One's spirituality, one's activism, however you define those terms. No given definition. How do you relate those, or do they relate at all? Everyone had some relation with one to the other. An overlap of different sizes, some containing one the other, some being identical in there. As I said early on in my education, I wouldn't have put either of those on the paper nor in some relationship with one another. But what's important, and I think my appeal in education, about education and what we're trying to do here, I think is summarized by this quote, and my colleagues will forgive me. Yes, it's Alfred North Whitehead, process philosopher. And he wrote in The Aims of Education, where he decried what was going on in education and so on, about teaching 1,000 subjects which nobody enters into deeply and so on. And he wrote this at the end of the first chapter. All education is religious. Pray, what is a religious education? A religious education is an education which inculcates duty and reverence. Duty arises from our potential control over the course of events. Where attainable knowledge could have changed the issue, ignorance has the guilt of vice. And the foundation of reverence is this perception, that the present holds within itself the complete sum of existence, backwards and forwards, that whole amplitude of time, which is eternity. So reading someone like Whitehead for me opened up a different way of seeing things. And I wouldn't call it necessarily spiritual at that time, I would now, but it was sort of a shift in perspective. And other classes were doing that the same way. We were forced to take as undergraduates a course in philosophy, and of course I took it with a Whiteheadian, Lewis Ford, and then of course in religion, where we started studying Taoism and Buddhism and so on. Those two opened up realms for me of seeing things differently. So it was not a great shift. It wasn't, you know, the lightning coming out of the sky, but it was a subtle but profound one, the way I would describe what happened there. And therefore, I think what we're hoping for at the School of Religion, that you go deep into those things that grab your attention. And it doesn't have to be, and I'm very thankful to say this because I would fail, it doesn't have to be the big lightning bolt from the sky. I often pray, God, please just give me the big neon sign to tell me what to do, where to go. it hasn't happened so far. So, you know, sort of feeling one's way along in the dark in that way. But to set the stage, to be able to see that there may be possible ways of seeing things differently. As Steve said, in the midst of all the horror that's going on, is there some goodness and beauty and truth that still abides in what we're doing? And I think my education in college, which is a very particular one, different than many, was one that did that. And my hopes, and I feel that ESR has tried to do that kind of thing to open up worlds of perspectives that we may not recognize are there, that can speak to us in our individuality rather than something built on. Education, its roots, means drawing forth, drawing out. Doesn't mean pouring in in that sense. In terms of the activism, there were some elements there too that prompted me to sort of now think that there are overlaps for me between the two realms in that way. One was very early on. I was 17 at that point, the Vietnam War, 1965. Everybody, even before they got a draft notice, was getting pre-induction physicals. So they packed us in a bus and rode from Long Beach into Los Angeles Armed Forces examination entrance and examination station. So first thing, you get a little intelligence test, and then you get your score. And I remember opening the score, and I got a high score. And I went, oh, this is great, I got it. And I'm going, wait a minute. I don't think, I'm not sure I want to be involved with this group, right? And then, of course, they strip you down, and you're cold in your clothes and your hands and your underwear, and you're following the yellow lines to different sessions where there's doctors and doing in checkups and all that kind of thing. So we got to where they're going to check your eyes, and here's a guy standing, we're indoors, of course. Here's a guy standing there. He's wearing a full dress uniform and dark glasses, and he's yelling at us. And someone goes up and makes a mistake on how they're using it, and he just rips this guy apart. I mean, we're, 17 years old and so on. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this. We're not even in the Army yet. What is this? But it gave me a very personal sense of, oh, this is something that a lot of people are facing. And of course, having conversations with people I knew that went to Vietnam and so on, and the horror of that, it became more clear. So I had the easy way out. I was conscious of going to be exempt from the draft because I had a student deferment, unlike many. So I didn't think too much about Vietnam, except this is crazy and horrible, but what can I do about it? I had other things on my mind. And of course, the damn war was still going on as I ended my undergraduate career. And so I had to sort out and figure out. So that was the next step of, being forced. Again, I was thinking I wanted to go teach. My parents were teachers. Some of the people I remember most fondly were teachers or coaches in my life. So I wanted to do that kind of thing. I didn't want to get involved in this awfulness. That's just ugliness, and it's crazy, and so on. So I had to face it because, hey, I could be drafted now. So I became a conscious objector, did 2 years of alternate service in a maximum security mental institution. So now I was forced to deal with the system. Now I was seeing a system close up. Gee, it's interesting that most of the crazy people here seem to be poor and of, non-white. What is this telling me about this? So I started to get involved. Did draft counseling. I started to try to do some advocacy I got in trouble for at the state hospital. I was an intervener in the licensing hearing for a nuclear power station in Central California. It's fun going up against a bank of Pacific Gas and electric attorneys. You remember the movie Aaron Brockovich? Yes, it's that piece of Pacific Gas and electric. So, and there were other things. But that process started then to connect things that I drew from my study as an undergraduate about religion and sort of feeling my way into that. And then the connection of going from the personal, don't get me involved in this, of being forced to be involved in it, and begin to make those connections for myself on now what's going to come forward. I came to ESR at one of those points, and many people do, and maybe different prompts, but some years after being involved in lots of activism. And part of the reason was I thought after the horror of Vietnam, after civil rights, surely we've learned, and surely things go better. And they weren't. And that brought me to, geez, I need to think a little bit more deeply. I'm either going to go into despair or rage. So, of course, I came to Earlham School of Religion to do that. So I hope that the students that are here can really bring themselves and enter into what we have to offer, knowing that we're not going to open your head up and pour it down your brain. Right? We want you to be participating and active and engaging with us, finding your own path of spirituality. And if it intersects with activism, great. Hope to see you around.
Thank you, Lonnie. Those of you who don't know Lonnie very well are learning some useful things about him. One is that he is a committed activist and a deeply spiritual person, but he's also very humble. So he begins by saying, well, I don't know anything about activism. And then he describes decades of doing it. So these are the kind of people I have to work with. So thank you, Lonnie. That was moving. I'm looking across my screen and I'm seeing Nancy Bowen. Would you like to offer us a few words, Nancy? As many as you'd like.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my father was a mechanical engineer and my mother was a high school math teacher, and neither of them ever told me I couldn't do something because I was a girl. So I was a physics major in undergrad and then ended up going to another school after my undergrad, where I started dipping my toes into the religious world, and then was told, like, well, you can't do biblical studies because women aren't supposed to do that. And I always thought, like, for God's sakes, I was a physics major. How hard can it be? I still remember when the first semester of Hebrew I took, I thought, I've solved differential equations harder than this. So that was sort of the beginning of my feminist activism, of sort of like, oh yeah, watch me. And I actually went to seminary because I thought I wanted to get a PhD in Old Testament and teach in a seminary where in particular I could be supportive of women in ministry, because in my pathway to this, there hadn't been any women to help me sort through what all those issues and questions are. So I know that in seminary I don't think there's a single final paper I wrote that within the first 2 paragraphs I hadn't mentioned the word feminist, because I was going to do, it's like all feminist all the time. And so I don't know that I particularly thought of it as activism, but just everything I approached, I was going to approach from that perspective of, does this support or hinder the well-being of women? And I have to confess, I lacked courage when I did my PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary, because I decided early on I wasn't going to do a feminist dissertation because I didn't want to have to fight that fight. But I thought, but when I get out, when I'm done, then I can do that work. And so the early part of my career was focused on doing feminist interpretation. And I served for a bunch of years on a steering committee for a section at the Society of Biblical Literature called Feminist Interpretation of the Bible, and was a co-chair of that. And then I served on the committee of the status and role of women in the profession of SBL, and was chair of that for a term. So when 9/11 happened, so I'd been at ESR for a decade then, and Bethany had been there for 6 years. you know, and people were rushing off to New York and DC and other places. And I'm thinking, well, what can I do? I'm just a little old Bible scholar. But what I thought I could do is like, well, I could take it as my task to work at how do we interpret the Bible in ways that don't continue to perpetuate the violence that's in the text or that's caused by interpretation of the text. So in some ways that was a way to sort of expand feminist interpretation. And when I entered the field, I saw all of the discussions among women scholars of like African-American scholars talking about how white feminist theology and feminist biblical scholarship was, and Jewish women critiquing the Christian women for their anti-Judaism, and then Latina women and Asian women, and then LGBTQ women came into the conversation. And so anymore, I try to think of that any feminist worth their salt is considering doing the work intertextually of recognizing where the different systems of oppression are and where they intersect with each other. And in recent years, it's like I've sometimes by accident mostly, so I've written a commentary on Ezekiel where I read that as a response to national trauma. And so I read everything I could about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and talked to any number of psychologists and stuff. And so read Ezekiel and read everything about trauma and then tried to have a conversation with them. Because of that work, I've ended up now branching off into moral injury, which is sort of a related field. And with that, what I ended up doing was rereading the story of Sodom and Gomorrah through the lens of moral injury, which makes it like an entirely different story than what you think it might be about. And that piece has now been published in 2 books. There's a new book out on moral injury. I will post some things in the chat. One is called Moral Injury, a guidebook for understanding and engagement. And unfortunately, a lot of these things tend to be really expensive. But if you come to ESR, we have this book as an ebook at Lilly Library that you can just log into Lilly Library and read. And so then the other things I've been doing in recent years is, so on a previous curriculum revision of like how can I work with the biblical text and connect it to the various area emphases. So I had a course on reading the Bible in global context. And Steve Angell and I taught Quakers in the Bible for a number of years, and he and Michael took over for that from me this last fall. Jim and I just this last January did Bible and Pastoral Care. I have a course called Writing Midrash to sort of connect with the writing program. So finding ways to connect interpreting the text with our area emphases. And then some because it's interest of mine and some because students were interested, teaching a class, I'm terrible at titles, Eco Bible. Mostly that came out of my science background because I wanted us to read the text taking science seriously. I mean, I wanted to connect it to ecological care and concerns, but I also, it's like, how do we read the Bible, you know, in one hand and the magazine Science in the other hand? And then last January, I taught an intensive on queer Bible. And in recent years, for intro, the book I'd used for a lot of years is written by 4 white Protestant men, all of whom I love dearly. They're all friends of mine. But I was inspired by a message that Steve Angell gave in worship on Philemon and thought, well, even as a feminist, do I or do I not believe that those who have been excluded or on the margins should be brought into the center, or at least into the circle of conversation. So for several years, I used the Africana Bible commentary, which is the chapters on, Genesis, 1st and 2nd Kings are all written by African Americans or those in the African diaspora. And then this year, we've been using the Queer Bible commentary as the sort of other primary text other than the biblical text. So those are the things I have been doing. And so a lot of it isn't like going out to the masses kind of thing, but of trying within biblical studies to model other ways of reading the text. Again, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who's a New Testament scholar, in an earlier work, and I don't actually think she originated this, I think maybe somewhere else, but that all theology, whether knowingly or not, is engaged for or against the oppressed. And so I just substitute all interpretation of the Bible, whether knowingly or not, is engaged for or against the oppressed. And so trying to work at the text in ways that it's engaged for the oppressed rather than against. So, I don't know if you've been told this information or not, but it's not a secret, but this is actually my last year at ESR. I will be retiring as of June. But my hope is that whoever ESR hires, so when I was hired, the job description said something like, I could make the connection between church and academy. It wasn't worded exactly that way, but I'm also United Methodist, and I'm an ordained United Methodist minister. And it's like, okay, I know, like Jim, it's like, if what we're doing doesn't matter to people, I'm not sure why we're doing it. So, and then they wanted somebody who could do something feminist, because that was like a new thing back in those days. And it's like, check. And then somebody who is interested in holistic education. So like Lonnie said, not just looking at students as the empty receptacles into which I pour forth my wisdom, but how are we engaged together in this educational enterprise? And again, as a feminist, that, part of being a feminist is to recognize, like, I'm not in this alone. This is not just me, that we all sort of can learn and engage from each other. So we haven't written the next job description, but I hope that whoever comes to ESR, they'll have their own set of interests and ways of doing activism. That person may actually be more like publicly engaged in terms of writing blogs or having podcasts, or, being better at social media than I am, to do more engagement that way, but they will come with their own interests and ways of thinking about the text, because I think the ethos of ESR is all about that. How do we engage our work on behalf of the oppressed and not against them? So I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nancy. Your passion for justice was evident, and I particularly appreciated how you interwove, how you saw your scholarship itself, as well as your work in the classroom, as in fact a scene of activism. So I know others will have.
Who knew that biblical scholarship could be an activist thing to do? That's not normally how it's advertised.
Well, we've been so fortunate to have you here to hold those two together. Oh, looking across my screen here, I see Ben Brazel. And Ben, you asked not to be first. Have we?
You've met the requirement.
Okay. I think I've listened to at least one person this afternoon.
Yeah. Okay. No, and I mean, as I've said here, enjoying listening to colleagues, I am reminded that this group fights about things, but I really like these people. And these are good people. So I'm really fortunate to get to speak in this lineup. And of course, you know, I get time to talk about the topic that probably fascinates me most of all, that being myself. No, but, you know, for me, as I try to think through the story I'm going to tell about myself here, one through line is that it's messy. Like it's not sort of systematically ordered or develops along kind of, you know, a predictable linear path. And I think part of that is because I am the sort of person who tends to, as soon as I arrive at a conclusion, I tend to start questioning it. As soon as I feel like I have found my people, I tend to start wondering if I've been overly tribal. So that kind of disposition has made me suspicious of almost everything I've ever done in some way, which can be a problem in trying to, when what is righteous is clear. But there really are, though, kind of three strands of interests that have been underlying like that messiness for me. And one has been like, you know, faith and religion. One has been writing and creativity. And the third, which may seem like an outlier to those two, is a deep love for the cultures and languages and people of Latin America. Let me tell that story a little bit. First, I'll say that I believe I am the only Catholic at either ESR or Bethany. And I tend to immediately follow that up in ESR context with, don't worry, I'm the sort of Catholic who plays nicely with Quakers. How do I get to be the sort of Catholic who plays nicely with Quakers? Well, let me tell you a story. So I grew up in Texas, and I grew up in a church, originally in a church that produced a couple presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention, although my parents eventually realized they were not fundamentalists and went something that was more like a proto-evangelical megachurch. Many people who grew up in that kind of evangelical scenario, who have moved out of it, as I have stories of deep scarring by that background, which I respect and I get. That's not really my story. I felt nurtured in that environment, and I still have some, I miss in some ways the sort of luminous meaning that kind of evangelicalism gives to all the world and all possibility, and the arc of one's life. But I went to college, and I would have to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, go Heels. I would have, you know, I don't know if I registered as a Republican at any point, but I would have when I was 18. Basically, almost everything I thought was sort of blown away, because I was also the sort of person who took my college studies really seriously and took like the life of the mind and what I could and couldn't affirm really seriously. And to make a long story short, the most important factor in that was that my looking at the Bible seriously convinced me that what I believed about it at that point in time, it just wasn't true. If this had to be true for Christianity to be true, then Christianity simply wasn't true, because this obviously wasn't, and I could tell you why. That was devastating to me. I mean, it was utterly unmaking to me as a person, and it took me years to piece it back together. But I also felt like, I mean, there's different ways to read why I'm still a Christian. One is that, you know, the more cynical view would be like, well, some people need comfort and can't let go. And the other would be that, like, maybe God made a kind of claim on me or forged a kind of bond with me that it wasn't easily cast off. I can't conclusively prove either of those things. I know the interpretation I prefer. But in any case, oddly enough, one way I found my way back, well, partly I took a philosophy of religion class, like, oh, wait, there's different ways to think about this? Really? No one ever told me there were different ways to think about this. Oh, okay, I'm interested now. And then, oddly enough, I haven't really talked about the love of Latin America. But one of my Latin American studies class, we read about like liberation theology and its role in Latin American history in Latin America in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And I was like, wait, there's this whole like kind of Christianity that talks about like liberation is like what God wants, and it's in Latin America. I'm like, okay, well now I never knew that there were different ways to be a believing person. And that, and along the way, I will add something that was really formative for me as someone thinking about economic systems was, and I'm going to qualify this, so be prepared. But like when I studied in Ecuador, I got a chance to, don't tell the government, but like I got the chance to go to Cuba because it was much easier then. And I was like, okay, don't stamp my passport, I'm going. And I went there thinking now is going to be your chance to see like the deepest poverty and deepest misery you've ever seen, going to communist Cuba, prepare yourself to see this. And then I got there, and while I certainly would not say it was, doing great, in many ways it was better than Ecuador, which was following like kind of our, the model we were putting forth. And you see, I won't go into detail, but I'd seen fairly horrific scenes of like children in poverty in Ecuador. And I thought, this isn't what people told me it would be. And I was like, I might have to think about this some more. And I would qualify that by saying, even now, sometimes on the left, people will romanticize Cuba, and that's a mistake. But because there's real suffering and abuse there. But by the same token, it didn't match what I'd been told. And so that began to change what I thought. After doing some time in Argentina, teaching English and working for a paper, I was a journalist in the US for a while in Charleston, South Carolina, soon realized that I hated covering local government and became a Jesuit volunteer. I became a Jesuit volunteer largely because I wanted to try out these different forms of Christianity I'd heard about and try living into them. And a friend that I'd studied in Ecuador with me said, have you heard about this organization? And he sent me the webpage, which I looked up at work, printed out the application at work, and I probably submitted at work. I wasn't Catholic. I had been raised to be somewhat suspicious of Catholics. This is a Catholic organization, but their values were, and you'll see why I confused them with the Quaker testimonies, simplicity, spirituality, community, and justice, which are quite similar to the Quaker testimonies. And maybe one reason that I'm the sort of Catholic who plays nicely with Quakers. But I did that. I worked on the border doing landlord-tenant law for a year, living in an intentional community, and that led me back into graduate school because I thought I would like to find out more about this different kind of faith and Christianity than the kind I grew up with. So I did 2 degrees at Emory, a Master's of Theological Studies and a PhD. I should say I'm not ordained by anybody, nor have I ever been. So I'm, and given my current affiliation, there is not likely to happen. But at Emory, I taught at something called the Youth Theological Initiative, which was kind of a faith and justice summer camp for high school kids for 3 weeks, where we did like faith and justice in the city of Atlanta. I did a lot of, I probably lost a semester or more to protesting things in Atlanta. During my PhD, there's Occupy Atlanta. There was various executions that we protested. There was immigration laws. There was a lot to protest in Georgia. Georgia was not trending. Well, it was starting to trend, but it wasn't as far along as it is now. And here, I have been to some like kind of protests. Like we've had local Black Lives Matter protests. I've been to a few of those, and I've gone elsewhere for like protests related to the climate. But here, I've really taken a different approach to. I don't know if activism is the right word, but I feel like I moved to a place, Richmond, Indiana, that is itself a kind of margin. It's not the kind of margin that gets written about tremendously in the progressive academy. But to me, given its economic trajectory and the level of poverty and decline that we have here, it is. And I think God cares about little downtrodden Midwestern places too. And so I've gotten to be on the board of Amigos, our local organization that serves the Latina community. I've gotten to start a storytelling project where we bring in people from all different walks of life to tell, just to have a good time and see their neighbors, new neighbors' stories on the stage. You know, and I get to do teaching that asks us to be midwives to other people's stories, and then give them back and allow them to speak into the world. And I recognize that I probably should stop talking. I will say one more thing. I also, back to the messy part, I also, the part where I argue against myself, I tend not to be a pure progressive. I mean, I'd say a Catholic progressive is probably fair for me. I tend to be suspicious in aspects of my own team, so to speak. I tend to think that not everything that goes under the aegis of justice is actually justice, and not everything that's motivated by right. I feel like anytime I, in particular, and maybe people in general, feel an overwhelming sense of righteousness, it may be a good thing to follow, but it's certainly a good time to stop and question that, because it's like moral crack. It feels really good to be outraged. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. What a wealth of experiences here. Truly, I'm not going to make you talk. When we were organizing this, there's one thing I realized wasn't clear. Was I supposed to talk or just moderate the panel?
That's up to you. I think others would like to hear what you have to say.
Talk, Michael, talk.
All right, briefly.
Michael.
Preach it, preach it, preach it.
See what it's like to work here. It's great. The let me try to keep it brief. Let me say a couple of things. In the Quaker world, we talk about feeling the weight of a concern, and that concern can be about justice, and it can lead to activism. Some years ago, I felt myself under the weight of a concern. This was before 9/11, but it had to do with how members of the Muslim community in the United States were being misunderstood and misrepresented. And I thought, well, what can I do about that? I'm a teacher. And the answer came, well, you can teach about Islam. So first I had to learn some things, and I did. And then I grew to have a concern, or let me just say that a passion, maybe even, that religious communities, different religious communities, can come to know one another appreciatively. Some people call this interfaith dialogue. That led me to interfaith service in different levels, from within the classroom to, I suppose you could say, on a kind of national level when I represented my religious community, the Quakers, on the Interfaith Relations Commission of the National Council of Churches. So I guess I would have to say that I regard my teaching about interfaith understanding as a form of activism. And I feel okay saying that now because Nancy paved the way for that. Thank you, Nancy. I would say that as someone who teaches spirituality, my own spirituality has been shaped by what I study, because there are just so many riches. My specialty is in Christian spirituality, but there are so many riches there, that so many practices, so much wisdom that has made my own life that much richer. So my scholarly study and my research shapes even my own religious experience. And this in turn deepens my commitment to, if we can call it a species of activism, my commitment to promote understanding across religious boundaries. I think my teaching and my service reinforce one another. My own spirituality opens me up to the spirituality of other traditions. And as I get to know them better, I become more eager to encourage this interreligious understanding, both in the classroom and beyond. So that's just a little slice of how, spirituality, scholarship, the classroom, activism, kind of overlapping circles to draw on Lonnie's metaphor. So that's a little bit about me. We are nearing the end of the first half of our time together. There's one other thing I'd like to do before we take a short break, and that is, while there's someone in our midst who is in the process of entering the Earlham faculty, so we haven't burdened him with being a formal member of this panel and coming up with something to say, but I want to celebrate his presence among us and give him an opportunity to introduce himself, because we are so excited to have you, Xavier Johnson, join us on the faculty. Would you like to just say a word about yourself, what you do, what you plan to do while you're here? Glad to have you with us.
Sure. And thanks again, Michael, for the opportunity. As you begin to learn your colleagues, you discover that there are some who are just too nice and too pleasant and too kind to say no to when they ask you to do something. And it would seem as if Michael is in that group. Grace to all of you. I am Xavier Johnson, and I am the incoming Director of Contextual Ministry Education and Assistant Professor of Practical Theology. I think my new official start date is April the 1st, April Fool's Day. Right? Yeah, that is kind of letting that.
Maybe you should have gone for April 2nd or March 31st or something, Xavier.
So yeah, I'm a Baptist. I'm a Baptist trained by Anglicans who will be teaching at a Quaker institution. Imagine that as a mixture. When it comes to activism and spirituality, my home denomination is the Progressive National Baptist Convention. And if you know anything about what we call the Big Four or Big Three among Baptists, there's the National Baptist Convention, which is the oldest African American Baptist denomination in the world. Then there is the National Baptist Convention of America, which is smaller, a bit more conservative. Then there is something called the Lot Carey Foreign Missions Society. It used to be the Lot Carey Baptist Convention. That is our missions arm in African American Baptist life. And then there's the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which was founded in 1956 by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Reverend Gardner Calvin Taylor and Bishop Booth. And it was founded out of a sense among Black Baptists that we needed to do more, that we should say more and be involved actively in the movement for civil rights and social justice in the world. And out of that was birthed a convention. That's the convention that I was called to ministry in. That's the convention I was ordained in. And so my spirituality and activism have always been connected. It's always been connected. So my area is clergy leadership. I generally write in that area, what it means to be clergy and offer leadership, community organizing, and clergy formation, vocational formation. That's my area. So I'm looking forward to talking to you all tomorrow. We're going to talk about the inward sea tomorrow, and spirituality and activism and commitment. So we're going to spend about half an hour in conversation with Howard Thurman and trying to see if we can weave all of that together in a way that makes it make sense. So with that, I'll be done. I hope everyone has been enjoying the week, and I look forward to learning so much more about my colleagues. I've been over here taking notes about things that I've learned today that I will hold tightly to my breast until such an opportunity where I can use it to capitalize on it. So anyway, be well. I hope all is well. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Xavier. We're so excited and look forward to the ways flourish, we hope, in this little community of teaching and learning that we call ESR. Well, friends, why don't we take about 10 minutes to attend to creaturely needs, like getting up and stretching, and then we can reconvene. Thank you. Well, friends are coming back. I see there's a note from Julie in the chat if you want to come to the information session. Let's do this. I was going to have the panelists reflect among themselves, but you've already seen how dangerous it is to give a professor an open mic. So so why don't we open it up to others who are in the Zoom room. You may have questions about, you may have a response to the subject of activism and spirituality, or many of you are here as prospective students for ESR. If you have questions, here are some professors you can say, you know, if you really want to know what Alfred North Whitehead had for breakfast, or other Lonnie hangs his head. What did I do? Or similar questions. This is a time for that as well. So those of you who haven't had a chance to speak, here's an opportunity to begin. Join.
Michael, Alfred is watching you.
Lonnie, Jesus is watching you. Meanwhile, other voices.
So, hi, I'm Joshua. Can I say something? Yes, I'm Joshua. I'm connecting from Kenya. Kenya, Africa. I'm a prospecting student. Sorry, I've joined late. I've been in touch with the jurisdiction for some time. And mine today is just to do a bit of reasoning. I'm interested to hear from all the professors and the team. And kind of like to get to know what's all this about. And I'm hearing quite much. I'm so excited. And I want to hear more. And then maybe I can ask questions later, or I can make my contributions later. That's Joshua. Thank you.
Thank you for your words, Joshua. Does anyone have a response to that immediately? We're glad to have you with us. Oh, did I see a hand?
Thank
Yes.
I
Ben.
think was nodding at me. It's obviously a big question, Joshua. What's this all about? The reason I raised my hand is I have a distinct memory of one of my master's degree professors answering this question at an orientation. And he said, theology isn't about God, it's about everything. And I think that's kind of true. This is about how you study, think about, express, formulate, change, alter, live into an account of the world and what it means to live within it in a way that is good, as that account itself defines good. So to me, it's what's it about is a question of many people think they're going to simply go deeper into what they already know. And that's rarely the case for most of us. It wasn't for me. It's also a case of having some of what you know challenged and undone in some cases, and trusting a community of students and professors to help you like reforge, remake, and sculpt it into like a whole life. So I guess that would be my answer.
I could probably say something, particularly from the Quaker point of view. I mentioned that that I was from the program tradition of Friends, but many friends, both here in the United States and in Africa and other places around the world, are from the program tradition. And one of the kind of the formative events of that as a historian was a conference that took place right where Earlham is in Richmond, Indiana, the Richmond Conference. It came up with a number of things, including a statement of men's doctrines and all sorts of things. But one of the more interesting moments was right at the end when a friend, a Quaker from Baltimore yearly meeting, stood up and with a great expression of horror said, if you, because the Baltimore Quakers were very strongly unprogrammed Quakers, and they could see that the sort of the program system with pastors was kind of taking over the Quaker world. And so she said, if you go down this path, and you will see that what will happen is that there will be a theological seminary at the end of this. This was 1887 that she said that. It took until 1960 to establish Earlham School of Religion. But indeed, her statement was prophetic. Whether her horror was justified or not, you can judge for yourselves. Obviously, everybody here, at least on the faculty, has come from a system of, this is really what the Spirit was actually directing us to do. We're here, and we think that God has a purpose not only for Quaker ministers, some of whom are pastors, and other Christians and pastors, that has a place for everybody in the ministry. But sort of the positive side, or sort of thinking back to her comment, it's what Quakers have always been working towards is a universal ministry. It's often said that one of our early professors, Elton Trueblood, said Quakers didn't abolish the clergy. Quakers didn't abolish the clergy. They abolished the laity. So everybody's a minister. So what all of us are doing is wanting to go back to our own Quaker meetings or churches and to empower others. And that's what we're really about here, is finding ways that we can be facilitators, or Elton Trueblood's favorite word was equipping people in ministry. He got that from Robert Barclay, the 17th century Quaker theologian. So, how can we equip people? My meeting is in Oxford, Ohio. Yours may be in Africa, wherever we are. And I'll stop with that.
And I'd follow up with what Steve said. Spiritual formation and spirituality is also talked about in terms of grounding ourselves. And so both spirituality and activism are contextual. So what's it all about? It's easy. Well, I wouldn't say it's easy. We theologians and academics often go into the universals, but it's important to be grounded in context, in the particulars of each person's situation. As a pastoral caregiver, I think of that in particular, but each situation in terms of a vision of the reign of God and the injustices that exist is so unique and important. So we need to ground down into our context that we're in. And so what's it all about? I certainly can't say what that is for you, Joshua, because although I've spent several months in Kenya, your context is very different from mine.
Yeah, for me, maybe just to respond a bit, I've worked with Quakers. I've interacted with Dr. Carter and Hope Carter for 8 years, and I know maybe you guys know them. And that's my first experience to interact with Quakers, working closely with them. And after the statement that one of you has just stated that we are all called to be ministers and to impact those who are around us, actually I've witnessed that through this couple, that what they do, whether it's in the hospital, whether it is teaching in the Bible school, whether it's interacting with them when you're going out in the teaching some primary schools around here, actually you can see their heart is that they're serving God in what they're doing. The congregation becomes the community you are serving at that particular point. That is the people you are ministering. That's the people you are showing God to. You represent the deity through what you're doing. So it's kind of like these people can experience God through you. And I've witnessed that, which is quite different with the other congregations that I've, I'm brought up from Anglican. I don't know what you call Anglican in American setting. But here we are, I'm an evangelical church. And that's where I go to. But it's kind of like when my experience with Quakers for those 7-8 years now, it has opened my eyes to see that it's not just about that you are ordained, but all of us are. We are all called to represent Christ in what you are doing, in that specific thing you are doing every day, every point, your walk, your talk, your actions should represent God. And that's what for me, that's what I could tell you guys, because I'm not a Quaker, yes, but I've worked with Quakers and I've come to admire them, what they are doing and their perception into life and to their calling to what they are called to do becomes a testimony and a reflection of who God is here on earth through us. Thank you.
Thank you for those words of wisdom, Joshua.
Thank you.
Other voices, other people want to join the conversation, picking up on anything from the first hour, or not, as the case may be.
What is your vision, friends, of the relationship and interconnections among spirituality and activism? And how does that relate to your interest in ministry?
We could start with Jane Stowe. You're at the top of, you're at the right left of my, or top left of my.
I'm one of the progressive voices on programmers, and I got more involved with activism throughout.
Jane, if you can lean forward and talk louder, you're a little hard to hear.
I think there was, okay. So if it gets garbled, let me know, because it happens with this computer sometimes. I'm unprogrammed progressive. I'm involved in activism fairly early with nuclear war issues, writing a letter to President Eisenhower to stop the H-bomb, and in Vietnam, and in the Senegal Women's Peace Encampment. I went to that. That was a great experience because everybody was happy. It was joined in. It was like a big party, a big celebration situation. It was wonderful.
Jane, if I might interrupt, are people others finding it as hard to understand as I am? It seems like the connection from Kenya is better than the connection to whatever street you're living on, Jane. I'm sorry, we may have to wait for your contribution for another time. It's just not coming across. The technology is not with us. Oops, did she disappear? Oh, don't let me do that to any of the rest of you.
I think she just turned her camera off to see if it might help, but I don't think it helped. We had the same problem the other night when she was on a session.
Well, it might be a good time to invite others to make a contribution. What have you been thinking as you've been listening?
This is Garrett. I have a question for all of you. I'm just wondering what you think in terms of how ministry is fitting into social media and like the emerging technologies, and like what role you see it playing without becoming a slave to those things, but also harnessing, that energy.
I'll answer in relationship to a couple of aspects. First of all, in terms of activism, ministry as activism. Social media has been both a boon to creating connections and to be able to mobilize people quickly and communicate so that you can organize a Black Lives Matter protest in a matter of minutes almost. And it also has been, I think, a hindrance because it is potentially reducing the embodied nature of organizing, where one-on-one conversations that have a kind of space to them is diminished and less important. That's just my own observation. Similarly, in terms of spirituality, we are finding new ways to create community. And community is one of the hearts of spirituality. And people are finding the ability to communicate and reflect deeply through the social media space, which is a particular advantage for introverts, for instance, who in more traditional communal spaces would hesitate to say anything. I don't know if this has been true in Quaker meetings, but certainly in my experience, introverts are more willing to speak up on a Zoom meeting than they are in a classroom. Somehow that distance helps them, and they have time to speak and to think and such. So I think the social media may cut in many different ways in ministry. And I think it's up to us to discern the ways that we can utilize it well to enable the things that are important and central to our ministries.
I think it's complicated. Almost every new form of technology has been met by the wider culture with one of two responses: either this will transform the world we live in, to this will be the death of whatever that we of our culture. And a number of years ago, I raised this issue, but it's like, so new technology comes along, it's like, oh, well, we have to do X, Y, or Z. And it's like, no one ever seems to stop to say like, well, let's query this from the perspective of our values and commitments and theology and understanding, and to ask the question of, does this particular kind of technology fit with our understanding of who we are and how we want to be in the world? If we decide yes, then what are the ways, how are we going to use this in a way to continue to, foster our beliefs and values and that kind of stuff in the world? And it's also, I'm so annoyed at people on Twitter that, have threads that are 50 tweets long. Usually it's like, if it's more than 5, I just stop reading and think, if you want to have something to say, you should go say it somewhere else. On the other hand, it's like, you just can't, it's how do you take really complex, concepts and try to reduce them to 240 characters, even if it's 4 or 5 tweets, for example. So it is a way I found to, well, it can function both to, in a sense, to solidify your silo, that you just keep hearing the same voices over, you get in your echo chamber, but it can also be a place where you can hear new ideas and new expressions, and hear critiques of whiteness, and learn about disabled issues and other kinds of things. So I don't have necessarily a clear answer for you, Garrett, except to say that it's complicated.
Thank you.
I'll try to be brief because I see someone has an answer in the chat. I mean, I think I've become more of like a maximalist about the impact of social media. Like, I think to the extent that we're immersed in it, it changes the experience. I mean, we have the same hardware, so to speak, but it taps into it in different ways, and it changes the experience of what it is to be a self, which is also social. It changes how we come to know what we think we know. It changes what social pressures we listen to respond to. I thought I wrote about travel in my dissertation, just to give you an example. And part of the conceit that at least sort of Westerners have had for years about travel is like, when you left the constraints of the place you were from, you kind of open up into this broader self because you weren't being defined by the social structures that were local to you. Well, now you carry your social structures in your pocket. So, does that still work anymore? I mean, that's just one example of, the ways this can happen. And I mean, I think there's all sorts of, you can organize a protest quickly, and also mental illness rates among young people are skyrocketing, almost precisely correlated to the introduction of the iPhone. So I think we're still parsing out all the things that means.
I see there are some questions in the chat. I just would like to point our collective attention to that, to see if anyone wants to respond to either of those invitations.
I'll respond to Kateri's question, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. I just finished reading Valerie Kaur's book, See No Stranger, and was deeply moved by it. I'd had it for months and months, just now getting around to reading it. She outlines 9 aspects of revolutionary love, some of which you might not expect, such as rage, but includes listening and wonder. It's a beautiful combination of memoir and memoir and spiritual reflections and critical analysis of of race relations and other aspects of the United States. And it will be, if you come into the MDiv program, you will likely be reading it, because I teach the first class that everyone takes, spiritual formation and personal practice, and I'm planning to require it this summer.
So I'll type this into the chat, but outside of my own discipline, Ivona Guevara is my new favorite theologian. She's Catholic, Brazilian, eco-feminist theologian. And I like what she writes because she believes the things I do and expresses them better than I can, so.
I think he's not really it's not so much about activism, but Christian Wyman's book, My Bright Abyss, has been one of the more spiritual reading experiences I've had recently.
Clooney's book on theopoetics, dense as can be, but it's beautiful to read, even if you don't understand it.
Michael, do you want to tackle the difference between like ESR and School of the Spirit, or somebody else, Steve, or?
I can say a couple words. Let me look at the question, see if I'm responding to it. There are a variety of institutions called School of the Spirit. I don't know if this question from Lisa has to do with the Quaker one. There is one. And some of us get invited to do things over there from time to time. One of the things that happens among the faculty at ESR, particularly in the Quaker world, but not just there, invitations arise to speak to the lay program at the Oblate School of Theology in Texas, or just to draw one name out of the hat. And so those of us who are here are very active, of course, in trying to do teaching and learning in this environment. But there's an ESR roadshow of sorts that happens out there in the wider world as well. Is that kind of what you were thinking of, Nancy, or?
Well, I don't know that I have a perfect answer for. I mean, it's one of the differences. I mean, we offer an actual degree, and in some ways our program reflects sort of the standards of the Association of Theological Schools, which is our accrediting agency, and and so we sort of have a larger goal. I mean, if you look at our mission statement of training you not just for life, but to be particularly about the task and work of being in ministry in some way in the world, and hoping to equip you for that. So that would be one of my answers to that question. you can take classes at ESR, sort of a form of continuing education if you want, but it also is, we're inviting you to come in for a specific length of time, for a specific purpose, to do this thing.
And if a full degree program is not what you're being led toward, we have our various certificate programs. The ones that I am connected with are Quaker Spirituality, Spirituality in a Multi-Faith World, Spiritual Exploration. There's a new one on Spiritual Formation, which is a kind of, offers a taste of our core formation courses in spirituality. So you get a sample of seminary in a sense there. Others could speak to other certificate programs if they.
I guess I would resist that an intellectual plane that doesn't intersect with the lived spiritual life. I just don't even believe that's a real thing. That's certainly not my experience. I mean, the intellectual plane is part of my spiritual life, and I don't see how I can live out my spiritual life without engaging my intellect. So I would push back against that sort of split in some ways.
Yeah, just as an example of what Nancy said, many years ago, we had Rosemary Radford Ruther here for our Wilson lecture. And of course, Ruther has been a long time involved in feminist concerns, ecological concerns, race justice concerns, and writing about that as a Catholic woman. And when she was here and unpacking her theological critique of what is, one of the students asked her, says, well, what about your spirituality? And she looked puzzled and looked back. This is my spirituality. So with Nancy, I could see how it could be experienced as being disconnected, but I would also go the other way. If the spiritual life is not somehow connected with what's going on in the world and the intellect and the heart, that too could be a danger. So I guess I hear the concern, but I think we all try to connect those. We may fail at times, but we try.
You do have to read books and write papers, however, and you will be evaluated on those. So,
well, I think for some people, the spiritual life is a gateway to the intellectual life, and they find that the one opens into the others. And for others, sometimes the intellectual life, in fact, opens the gateway to the spiritual life. So I think what I'm hearing is that in this school, we try to bring the two into conversation, into harmony, into a mutual enrichment. Ben, you had your hand up a little earlier. Were you about to share something?
What was I going to share? I guess I just say that one thing that I think does distinguish ESR is we're fairly genuinely holistic in how we approach seminary education. Like, people who come with a more like academic kind of focus often wind up saying, I can't believe I'm being asked to reflect about my journey again, because there's a lot of reflective spiritual stuff that we do, but in partnership with the intellectual part, which, yeah, I mean, I think everybody here would affirm that, we think they go together, and they can reinforce each other, or they can correct each other. Most of us have a bent one way, to sort of one way or the other, or to in some other direction. And all of us in some ways can benefit from having our particular predilections challenged. And I think that's something that happens and should happen for almost everybody who comes to a seminary. I'll stop there.
And as an example of our holism, there's at least one other leg of engagement of community and world, whether it be obviously through the contextual education that Xavier spoke about when he was here, or we require two other classes that involve practicums I teach a class on community organizing. Lonnie teaches classes where people go out into the world and do things and do research and learn about the way the world is. So spirituality and intellect are also not necessarily vacuous, but much less of quality and impact without getting into the world and engaging it. Maybe with activism involved. You're muted, Michael.
Thank you. It's usually better that way. I see we have another question in the chat that any number of people could respond to. Anyone want to begin that conversation?
Steve?
Michael, could you repeat the question? Because I'm not sure which one you talked to.
Oh, this is the one that begins at the last item in the chat board room. I don't even know the right terms. In my own recent reading on issues impacting the Quaker movement, I've noted how discussions on whether to affirm or not sexual and gender minority persons have led to disagreements and even schism, such as in the Indiana Yearly Meeting and the resulting New Society of Friends. Could any members of the faculty talk about how this has affected life at Earlham? ESR. Self-disclosure, my original spiritual home is United Church of Canada. I'm ordained in the metropolitan community churches.
Well, yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think, you know, it's almost the other way around, because beginning in the 1990s, if not before, but Earlham and Earlham School of Religion were strongly moving toward a kind of a welcoming and affirming position. And as a result, a lot of LGBTQ friends and members of the Metropolitan Community Church and other Christians, and some maybe seekers or, you know, found us. And you know, as Nancy Bowen talked about earlier, you know, she was offering a course in Queer Bible this past year. You know, so it's definitely something that has really leavened the life, you know, enriched the life of the seminary, and increased the learning. Not always made it easier, but that's okay, because sometimes learning is hard. And then, so the other part about Indiana Yearly Meeting is that some of you may notice, if you live in the United States or maybe even outside of it, that Indiana is one of the more conservative parts of the United States. It's also a stronghold for Quakers and Quaker churches, programmed or pastoral Quaker churches I mentioned earlier. And many, but not all, of those churches are culturally conservative, and also then many put forward a standard of sexual conduct that is based on how they interpret the scriptures, and one that is generally not welcoming and affirming to openly LGBTQ people. So that's been a particular struggle for the school over the past 10 years. And in some ways reacting to what's going on in Earlham, and other ways reacting to what's going on in broader society. In 2013, Indiana Yearly Meeting did, as the questioner mentions, have a separation and 18 of the roughly 61 meetings or congregations within Indiana Yearly Meeting then split off to form the new Association of Friends. A few of those actually went independent. So there now are 2 Quaker bodies, 2 yearly meetings where there was one before. Some similar things, not exactly the same, have been going on in the other programmed yearly meetings in the area. So Western Yearly Meeting lost a lot of Quaker meetings that went independent, Quaker churches, over concerns about, sort of biblical standards there. And then Wilmington Yearly Meeting, which is Wilmington, Ohio, a little bit to our east, also lost some congregations to independent status just over the past 2 or 3 years. So it's definitely an earth-shaking kind of event among Quakerism in our area, and I hope that it's in the long run that that there will be spiritual growth coming out of it on all sides. Right now, it seems pretty difficult. Because many people, many of us are used to those broader connections, and there's been some disruption there with the separations. But also same token, some of the things that were issues before, such as whether ESR graduates could be. We don't have ordination among Quakers, but whether they could be recorded, in some ways that's an equivalent term. That's been resolved. So the new Association of Friends is recording our graduates, and they're also getting recorded in Western and Wilmington Yearly Meeting, whereas Indiana Yearly Meeting was giving us considerable problems on that before. We live in strange times, and the same forces that have been affected in the broader society have been affecting ESR as well. But I think the community at ESR is stronger for what we've been going through. I'll give just one specific example at this point. The West Richmond meeting, which is 2 blocks from ESR, in some ways, was kind of a major impetus for the formation of the new Association of Friends. It adopted a welcoming, affirming policy towards LGBTQ people back in 2008, it was particularly targeted with a lot of innuendo and very difficult, one might even say at times hateful language over the next 5 years as the separation developed. One of our LGBTQ students who was not a Quaker, but a member of the Metropolitan Community Church, felt deeply led to do his supervised ministry in West Richmond Church to support them as they were going through this difficult prophetic time. I think that was immensely valuable both for the meeting, the West Richmond meeting, and for the student who then, after graduating, went back to ministry in his Metropolitan Community Church. Maybe that's enough. Others can add.
I want to mention that I wrote in the chat about what I was trying to talk about. So if anybody wants to read it, and I also responded to Julie. Did you hear this any better? Because I did another thing that sometimes helps. You could? Great.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah. I unmute my wireless, and that can help too. It's crazy.
Well, good people, we are coming to, I think I see the landing field, and we're descending. Keep your seatbelts on for now, but our time is coming to a close rather soon. Are there who has some final words of wisdom or provocation for us? Thought-provoking, I meant.
Well, this is somewhat frivolous, but in terms of things we might be reading, I don't know if any of you know the author Louise Penny, who writes these sort of detective mysteries set up in Canada that really have some interesting spiritual components to it. The news came out today that she and Hillary Clinton are co-authoring a thriller together called State of Terror, and I just like, whew, I'm so excited. This is the other sort of, professors are real people too, and we have, we sometimes have some interesting tastes and quirks.
I live in social isolation, and I've already heard Nancy mention this twice today. So.
Yeah.
Does the State of Terror link with Ezekiel? Or?
Oh, Lord, I hope not.
You're talking to the right person there, Sam. Nancy Bowen's quite the Ezekiel expert. For those of you who don't know, she wrote a commentary on the whole thing. So, and yes, there's sufficient terror in the book of Ezekiel, I think you'd probably say. Yes, Nancy? Well.
Michael, did you grow up a Quaker? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Jane.
You grew up a Quaker, unprogrammed or programmed, or what? How you didn't say what you grew up as?
Oh, I didn't grow up as a Quaker. I had to find them. They hid themselves.
Okay.
People think I grew up as a Quaker because I speak it so fluently. It is almost like my mother tongue. But in fact, it's an acquired. I was going to say acquired trait, but maybe acquired taste is a way of saying it. I don't want to end this talking about me, so why don't we? I want to thank everyone who has come today. I want to thank all the speakers who have shared of the fruits of their labors of thought and action. I want to thank all the others who have been sitting in this Zoom room, some of whom we've been able to see and hear, some of whom have been in situations where you are just you are only a name on the screen, but we know that a very important person bears that name. So thank you to all of you who've been a part of this. There will be
Thank you
more.
for your time. Time is precious these days, so thank you for that gift.
Julie, do you want to point, are there any announcements that relate to the week that you want to point us toward?
I will have an information session tonight at 5:30, and then maybe Kristen, if she hasn't already, if she could just put in the chat the events for tomorrow. Xavier will be presenting tomorrow, and there's one other. Hold on just a moment. I can tell you what that is. I have to pull up my calendar. Karen Tibbles will be presenting tomorrow about an article, I believe. She's an ESR graduate, and then Xavier. So that will be going on. And then we'll have another information session coming up in just a couple weeks, and can speak specifically about some of the programs. You all know that you can contact me anytime, and I can Zoom with you to talk specifics. But also any of our faculty here are more than willing Zoom with you and talk to you about your interest in the programs. That's
Thank you,
all I
Julie.
know.
Julie, thank you. And people have been thanking me all week for this event. And I say to them, oh, you're welcome. But then I say, but you're actually also mistaken, because the heavy lifting has been done by two people who are in this Zoom room. And I want to just acknowledge both of them with a deep gratitude. Julie Dishman, of course, and the person who is hiding behind the little box on your screen that says ESR events, Christian laws. So, and Julie is saying thank you mostly to Kristen. Grateful to you both. And once again, a wonderful time together. Blessings on all.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you, Michael. That was great.